Good evening, everybody. We can have everybody on Zoom. It's fantastic to see you, and everybody who's made it here tonight. It's really great to see you as well. We're going to have a lovely talk tonight with Harry Jenkinson, who's is an author. We've just had this lovely book, seen the sight of this book, Wild Service, Why Nature Needs You. We're hoping to get a copy soon. Land justice and Indigenous rights campaigner, specialising in environmental anthropology and access to nature. And Harry's been a man after our own heart because he did a special action, or he was part of organising a special action with Right to Roam on trespass, but at night time, at the night of the dark moon, when people should have access to be able to see the Milky Way and the stars. It was too far away for us to join it, but Harry stood in and gave a lecture to everybody gathered there under the stars on lunarchy, the importance of the rhythm of the dark moon.
Ruled by the moon.
Ruled by the moon in human history and
Where
time.
was this?
2022.
Where?
Oh, in Northumberland, in the Duke of Northumberland's estate.
They trespassed Duke of Northumberland's estate, yes, which should impress even June. So I'm going to hand over to Harry because he's got a beautiful presentation. I'm going to sit back and enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and thank you everyone. It's a real honour to be here and speaking in front of RAG, and I think it's very, very exciting seeing kind of anthropological minds and everyone really gathering together to talk about some really wonderful radical ideas about the human species and about our relationship with one another and with our fellow species. So yeah, my name is Harry and I'm from the Right to Roam campaign. We're a national campaign calling for the right to roam, to right to access nature and to reconnect with nature again. They've had a national right to roam in Scotland since the year 2003, and yet here in England we are barred from the overwhelming majority of the countryside and of nature. So we're trying to have access to nature, not only because it's good for us and because it's fun, but also because it's good for our fellow species as well. And I feel like growing up in the English countryside, I've kind of walked in two worlds really. I've always been part of the world of the English countryside, but also being an Indigenous rights campaigner, I've spent a lot of time with Indigenous peoples around the world, and these have always been two worlds, and now this is the time I get to kind of collide them together, which is really, really good fun. And I'm going to be talking a bit about Wild Service, the book that we published this April, which is all about this kind of philosophy, the philosophy that we have named Wild Service, about a reciprocal relationship with nature that we as human beings have always had, but we are losing when we are separated from nature. How can we break this kind of cycle of disconnection and make it a cycle of reconnection with nature? So I'm going to be speaking about that and about some wider themes of the human species in terms of our reciprocity with nature, and linking that in with the right to roam and with Indigenous rights campaigns as well. And before I kind of really kick off, I'm going to show a clip from a short film. This was a film filmed by Connor, who's known to RAG. I don't think he's here this evening, but he basically filmed us at the River Roding in Barking. The River Roding is London's third largest river. And earlier this year, we held a Wild Service action led by Paul Powsland, who also gave a speak at RAG. You might remember, he's part of the Right to Roam campaign, where we picked up litter from the river. We planted really rare trees like black poplar, like the Wild Service tree, because there is also a tree called Wild Service. And we cleaned up pathways and stuff, and we wanted to show people that even in a very deprived kind of industrial and in fact post-industrial landscape, human beings can have a positive relationship with nature when we are connected to it. So here's a short clip of Nadia, who helps to coordinate Right to Roam, talking about some of the themes of Wild Service and why all of this stuff is very important. Throughout the whole presentation, I'm going to mildly struggle with 4 screens and many cables, but we'll see how it goes. So this is Nadia from Right to Roam.
Humans do this amazing thing intuitively. Indigenous cultures around the world are still doing it and have this long line and lineage of culture going back millennia, thousands of years of that kind of way of being in a landscape, which we've forgotten because we don't have access to land, we don't own it, and we don't have agency to care for it. We've lost that ability to intuit. And that is Wild Service. Wild Service is rekindling what is within all of us and loving people again as part of nature, as opposed to something separate from it that damages it.
humans do a thing intuitively. We always care. We naturally connect with nature. It's an unnatural separation that is disconnecting us from our fellow species. Where does this all begin? I think it begins with us, our evolution as a species. I don't think there's anything whatsoever wrong evolutionarily with human beings. I think this has come from political systems which have separated us from nature. So what does this really mean in terms of humans being outside, and how does our kind of mobility and our time outside have influence on this? Well, I'm going to start by arguing I think human beings are a nomadic species, basically. For over 95% of human history, our ancestors, whoever you are, have been nomadic hunter-gatherers. And we know for a fact that nomadism among hunter-gatherer peoples today is centrally tied to understandings of ecological balance, understandings of ecological reciprocity among species. For the simple reason that if you're hunting and gathering from a landscape, if you're not planting fixed crops, you're going to have to migrate, you're going to have to move around in order to not exhaust the various game animals, plants, fruits, etc. in one particular area. And hunter-gatherers know this better than anyone. You know, in their migrations, their nomadism, their walking, it's not aimless wandering, it's very systematic moving around their territories and understanding the balance of nature to allow various living species to regenerate and to regrow again. It's always been kind of part of who we are. And of course, there are many hunter-gatherer groups around today, many of whom are still nomadic. But the state, for whatever reason, cannot cope with nomadism. The state, after indigenous peoples are forcibly contacted by the state, one of the first things that generally happens for nomadic hunter-gatherers is that they are forcibly settled in one location. Something about the idea of marginalized communities being outside of state power and being able to move around is really, really abhorrent to the idea of this state. But there are nomadic hunter-gatherers around today who still are, you know, living nomadically and still maintaining ecological balance, and they will talk about migrating in order to allow forests and the environment and the land in which they live to regenerate and so on. And of course, most people actually still move. So the average British person moves 8.7 times in their lifetime. For Americans, it's over 11 times in their lifetime. We move up everything. All your belongings move, house completely, entirely move. And yet we wouldn't regard them as being nomadic populations, you know. Most people here would regard us ourselves as being sedentary, and of course we generally are pretty sedentary. But isn't it interesting how nomadic hunter-gatherers are seen as backwards for never staying in one time? And of course there's never been more human beings on the move at any one time before. There are many, many millions of people being forced to move the entire time. Because of the crises of militarism, war, climate change, biodiversity collapse, all of these kinds of things. And you know, globalization is a part of that, but a lot of this is you know, it's a refugee crisis. It's not like, you know, people aren't just moving because they want a better life and so on. And again, we see that the abuse and the kind of like abuse towards people, the denial of that freedom of movement is a denial of a human right to roam, a human right to have be able to migrate and to move. And I think it's a fundamentally interesting, again, that capitalists and the free movement of capital has never really faced problems. Nigel Farage a couple of months ago gave some kind of weird talk about capitalist mobility, whatever it is, but it's one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us. So nomadism among the marginalized is discriminated against, yet among the super rich it's very much celebrated, basically, which I think is very telling. Humans are good for nature. This is something I also want to talk about. The idea that we're somehow a curse upon nature, that we've evolved wrong, is absolutely ridiculous. You get these bloody awful pop anthropologists, people like Jared Diamond and Yuval Noah Harari. He will basically argue humans are bad. If you put human beings in one place for long enough, they're going to destroy the environment. These sell loads of copies and people read that. And this is an idea very much supported and allowed by kind of capitalist power, because they'd like us all to believe that we're inherently selfish, that we're inherently bad for nature, so that the ones who really are destroying nature can get away with it, basically. Jared Diamond uses the example of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island as it's called in English, which is a Polynesian island, where he says, look at these indigenous islanders, they didn't know how to look after themselves, they were so obsessed with building these big statues that the ecology of the island was destroyed. Easter Island was being destroyed because of colonialism, because of slavery, and that's what happened to the island. You don't destroy your own home. No one here is going to take a bulldozer and glyphosate and chop down their own home, chop down their own garden. You know, it's just not what people do. It's this idea that human beings are bad for nature needs to be dispelled, and here's a very good example of it. This is North Sentinel Island, part of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean. Politically, it's part of India today. And it's home to a people the rest of the world calls the Sentinelese, but no one knows their real name because they are an uncontacted people. They became especially famous in 2018 for killing a US missionary, defending themselves against a US missionary who was trying to forcibly contact them and convert them to Christianity. In the process, could have wiped them out through diseases to which they had no immunity. So no one knows how long the Sentinelese have been on their island before. It's certainly hundreds of years, very likely to be thousands of years. We do know that their ancestors came to the Andaman Nicobar Islands tens of thousands of years ago. It's actually very possible that they've been on this island and neighbouring islands for over 50,000 years. As you can see, the island, just by satellite data alone, is 100% basically covered in tropical rainforest. This idea that human beings will destroy a landscape, this isn't because they haven't got bulldozers. If you gave bulldozers to the Sentinelese, they wouldn't want to chop down their own rainforest, right? It's ridiculous. We know that many hunter-gatherers have strict taboos against cutting down any trees whatsoever. From reports of many hunter-gatherers in the region not even chopping down, like cutting leaves, allowing leaves to be cut, So this idea that human beings are bad for nature can be very clearly illustrated by the fact that, if you're there, even if you're there for tens of thousands of years, you're not going to destroy the land that you're part of. In fact, quite the opposite. I think there is a lot of evidence indeed for enhancement of nature by indigenous communities and by enhancement of the landscape. Human beings are like beavers, basically. Today, beavers in Britain are praised for their role as ecosystem engineers. They create wildlife ponds, they do all this kind of things. I met a paleoecologist when I was studying in Greenland, and he said to me, humans are like beavers. We're like bipedal beavers, basically. We know how to do these things as well. We are also ecosystem engineers. When we are truly connected with nature, we create biodiversity rich habitats like beavers do. I was going to call this talk Humans are Bipedal Beavers. I'm very glad I didn't. It would be a bit confusing. Thank you. But I was tempted to. Right, so what does this look like in the kind of English countryside? What did it look like in the English countryside? This is an imagined image from Star from around 10,000 years ago. And these are some of the an artist's impression of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who used to live in this lake. This is in North Yorkshire today, basically. What did you call it? Star is the name of the lake. That's what it's known as, basically. So when archaeologists and so on have done digs around here, they found an enormous amount of tools, antlers, spears, bows and arrows, that kind of thing. It was an inherently incredibly rich, biodiverse area. I've used this example to talk about what the English countryside last looked like when people were very, very connected with nature. The kind of massive collapse in biodiversity has happened not because of us as human beings, it's happened because of various political systems of dispossession of people from the land and of the land from and other species. Since the year 2000, according to one study, we've lost over 60% of flying insects in Britain. Since the year 2000, insects underpin our entire ecosystem. If you can imagine that's happened since the year 2000, and you think, oh, there's not much wildlife now compared to the year 2000. This was, 10,000 years ago. It was very, very different. It was very rich in wildlife. It was being stewarded very, very well by people indeed. This is an example from a very nearby site near Scarborough, where the archaeologists basically, who had been digging around here, had basically found that the arrowheads, the spear points and so on, were being broken apart very systematically and placed in trenches along with the animal bones and so on. And it is totally purely speculative, but the archaeologists who've done the dig have assumed that because this was done so deliberately, that it was likely done associated with various taboos around animals that you do hunt, animals that you don't hunt. Among many indigenous peoples today, the breaking of arrows, the breaking of spears is done as a symbolic thing to end conflicts, around local taboos, that kind of thing. One of the chief archaeologists at the dig, whose name was Dr. Amy Gray-Jones, said, people think of prehistoric hunter-gatherers as living on the edge of civilization, moving from place to place in search of endless search of food, but here we have people inhabiting a rich network of sites and habitats. They aren't people who were struggling to survive, they were confident in their understanding of this landscape and their behaviours and habitats of different animals and species who lived there. So we're going to show just an example of what the English countryside might have looked like when people were incredibly closely connected with land, had a very intimate understanding of land indeed. I'm going to hop around the world quite a bit because I can do this digitally, but I can't physically. But so here's another part of the world entirely. This is a map of Inuit territories in the Arctic. This has been made by the Inuit Circumpolar Council, who represent Indigenous Inuit Peoples Affairs. And as you can see very clearly, there's no border here, right? If you ask many Indigenous peoples who live across nations, they will say the border crossed us. We never actually crossed the border. Inuit people today live all the way from Chukotka in Russia to Alaska, Northwest Territories in the province, and down in other parts of Canada, and Kalaallit Nunaat, as it's known in Kalaallit in Western Inuit, but also as Greenland to the outside world. The Inuit, of course, also historically nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples. Most of them are been settled forcibly today. And they again have incredibly close relationships with the animals in which they hunt. I've personally never seen more love for animals in my entire life than I have from Indigenous people who hunt these animals. It's an incredible love that they show to these species because they rely on them and because they need them. Some Inuit today still will put snow into the mouth of a seal after killing it, and they'll say, well, the spirit of the seal, we don't want it to get thirsty. It's these incredible forms of love that are being made, basically. They believe, like a lot of Indigenous people who hunt animals, that they're kind of giving themselves up to the people, as in the way that humans will give up their own lives at the end of their lives as well. It's very, very moving indeed. And the area I was looking at for my master's degree, so my background is in anthropology in undergraduate and my MA. For my master's thesis, I was looking at an area called Pikialasoswak, which in English is known as the North Water Palynia. It's right in the very, very far north, one of the furthest inhabited human places in the world, between the far north west of Greenland and the far northeast of Canada and Nunavut province. A Palynia is a kind of area which is permanently ice-free in the winter. So the rest of the Arctic freezes over in the winter, still just about, and is ice-free and mostly ice-free in the summer. A Palynia is kind of a natural area which is ice-free even in the winter because of various ocean currents, biological activities, and so on. Pikialasoswak is regarded as the most biologically productive area in the Arctic. It's very, very biodiverse. It has huge levels of biodiversity which contribute greatly to Arctic ecology, basically. And it has been guarded and looked after by the Inuit for an incredibly long time, for thousands of years, by Indigenous peoples in the area. And I was looking at this area in particular because the Inuit have an incredibly bold plan for a conservation plan for the area, one which is controlled entirely by Inuit and not by conservationists who would seek to deprive them from hunting, to deprive from living in the ways that they would like to and know how to live. So here's an interesting example. This is, these creatures are little orcs, not little orcs that Treebeard talks about in Lord of the Rings, but little orcs as in a little kind of seabird, basically. Little orcs are believed to have arrived in the northwest Greenland around 4,400 years ago. Jenkinson et al. Have done some really fantastic research talking about how they've massively helped to shape the Palynia. They've kind of helped to create this as a biological area. If you take the little orcs out of the equation, the Palynia would collapse. Human beings in the Inuit and their ancestors arrived there 4,500 years ago. So human beings have been there longer than the little orcs have. They too have shaped the Palynia. If you take the Inuit out of the area, if they are not allowed to hunt as they've been hunting and their ancestors have been hunting, just like if you take the little orcs out, then the whole system will collapse. This idea that humans are somehow an invasive species, that we're non-native, but other species are worthy of conservation is ridiculous. And in fact, even in Britain, I would argue that human beings are a native species because we've been there for tens of thousands of years. When the ice melted and animals and plants came back to Britain, I haven't got the data on this, but I imagine there were many creatures like little orcs who arrived after humans did. We have to totally change our mentality, and I think decolonize our mentality of seeing humans as somehow invasive or non-native. As a species, we have just as much right to exist as the polar bear or the narwhal or the little orc or whatever it may have been. So I can skip forward a little bit here. So this is an example. This is looking across from Kalaallit, Greenland, across the Palynia to Canada. These are Inuit people who arguing in their plans for the Pikialasoswak that they need to have an Inuit free travel zone, basically. Again, they would argue that the border crossed them. They never crossed the border between Greenland and Canada, yet they are not allowed to cross anymore. And I've cited one Inuit who said, I am controlled by Southerners. Southerners being anyone who's not not an Inuit, basically. I'm not allowed to see my relative in Canada without having a picture, by which he meant passport, basically. Even though traditionally the Inuit had crossed with dog sleds, with kayaks, and with boats and so on, the Inuit are arguing very, very passionately, and I definitely think correctly, that if they're not able to have that ability to be nomadic, to be able to be mobile, to be able to travel and be out in nature, out connecting with their fellow species, the Palynia will collapse. They have to be able to hunt. They have to be able to know when to hunt. They have to have a guardianship-style relationship with their environment in order to kick out those who are seeking to destroy it. So one of the demands for their conservation zone is to A, have a conservation zone controlled by Inuit, and B, to have it free movement around the area controlled by Inuit people, for Inuit people. It's an incredibly inspiring vision indeed. As we know, the Arctic is changing to an incredible degree, not only because of accelerating climate change, but also because of geopolitics, and it's making everything very unstable indeed. The Inuit are very good at predicting such things. They've always lived in relative levels of instability in the Arctic. This was a photograph I took outside the village of Akatut. It shows an Inuit guy in a kayak. Kayak is an Inuit word, just like anorak and a lot of other words. It means kayak. Inuit people have been hunting in kayaks for an incredibly long time. It's sort of an enormous iceberg. I took this photo and I'm going to show it now transposed with a very, very different photograph. Basically, when I was there in the village, the Inuit people had hunted a bowhead whale, which I think is sometimes called a Greenland whale. I can't even imagine how many people. I've seen in Melanesia, I've seen one pig feed something like 300 people. I can't imagine how much a whale would have fed, but it's, they only kill these animals rarely, but they, kill them in an incredibly sustainable way indeed. Very soon after, just a few days after they killed that whale, this arrived in the bay. This is a Danish warship, and it was in Akatut. Bear in mind that European whaling ships eliminated, I think, over 90% of the whale population of Greenland and the Arctic. It was there to monitor Inuit whaling and fishing, and to say, we're here to make sure that you're not overfishing and over whaling in your own village. I think the village had about 49 people in it. I think this ship was pretty much bigger. I've never been so intimidated in my entire life as to see this bloody great massive ship with big cannons docking on front of it as well. It was absolutely terrifying. And I think the militarization of conservation, including in the ocean, is an incredibly intimidating presence for Indigenous peoples and a constant colonial reminder. Greenland, Kalaalleq Nunaat, is still under Danish control. The level of racism that I saw towards Inuit people by Danes when I was in Greenland was absolutely horrific. And again, it's this kind of constant reminder of colonization, a constant reminder of fear, basically. And I think it's very telling that that's kind of what's happened nowadays. Even I think in colonial times, people didn't, sometimes people would just directly kick Indigenous peoples off the land and say, you're getting out of here, we're coming in. It definitely, undoubtedly happened an enormous amount of times. However, there often was the excuse, right? And the excuse was often, you don't know how to manage your land. You're not looking after it properly. This is something we see increasingly. And nowadays, capitalists will use terms like ecosystem services and natural capital. Your area is high in natural capital. What they really mean, it's got enormous levels of biodiversity, and natural resources. So often it means that they'll allow logging companies to come in under the guise that they're sustainable logging companies, sustainable fishing companies, etc. And also they'll allow conservation schemes to come in, and increasingly now through so-called biodiversity or carbon offsetting. All of these are horrible, greenwashed, false solutions, basically. While these companies are allowed in, Indigenous peoples are routinely evicted from their own territories, not allowed to hunt, not allowed to live in the ways that they had been. And it's incredibly brutal procedure indeed. This is an example of whales being, just hunted massively by Europeans and very nearly eliminated. So going over to the very far side of the world again and talking about what this looks like to Indigenous peoples elsewhere and how this all links in with wider aspects of colonialism and enclosure. This is a scene from Karnataka state in the south of India, and in a place called Nagarhole Tiger Reserve, where an Indigenous Adivasi group called the Jenkinson have been living for kind of untold generations. Now, in the name of conservation, many Jenkinson people are being forced out of their ancestral forests to create a tiger reserve. The Jenkinson worship tigers. They would never hurt tigers, whatsoever. They worship the tiger as a god. The irony now that they are being forced out, they're being forced to trespass by conservationists who are trying to say, you don't know how to look after the environment properly. We do. It's this horrible kind of colonial mentality. So this is a short clip of two Jenkinson guys speaking about that. I've shown this video previously and I've been told that the subtitles are quite difficult to read across the room. So if anyone wants me to explain afterwards, just raise your hand and I can run through basically what they were talking about.
ಹೊರಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿರುವಂತಹ ಲೈನ್ ಮನೆಗಳು ಕಾಫಿ ತೋಟದ ಮಾಲೀಕರ ಲೈನ್ ಮನೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಜೀತದಳಗಳಾಗಿ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕು, ಈ ಕಡೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕು, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಂದೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆಗಳೆಲ್ಲ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮನೆ ಇದ್ದಂಥದ್ದೇ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕಲ್ಲುಗಳು ಮನೆಗೆ ಸೈಡ್ ಭಾಗಕ್ಕೆ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಹೋಗಿ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಹಾಕಿರೋಂಥ ಮನೆ ದಳ ಇದು. ಎತ್ತರಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆ ಗುಡಿಸಲು ಹಾಕಿದಂಥ ಇದೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಸಹಿತ ಕಲ್ಲುಗಳಿದು. ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣವಾಗಿ ಇಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ವಾಸ ಇದ್ದಿದೆ. ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಹಿರಿಕರು ಅಷ್ಟು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ನೆಮ್ಮದಿಯಾದಂಥ ಜೀವನ ಬದುಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದನ್ನು ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣವಾಗಿ ಇಲಾಖೆ ಏನಿದೆ, ಇಲಾಖೆಯವರ ದೌರ್ಜನ್ಯದಿಂದಾಗಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೀವನನೇ ಅತಂತ್ರ ಆದಂಗೆ ಆಯಿತು. ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಹಿಂಸೆಯಿಂದಾಗಿ, ಅವರ ಒಂದು ದೌರ್ಜನ್ಯದಿಂದಾಗಿ ಇವತ್ತು ನೆಲೆ ಇಲ್ಲದೆ ನಾವು ಯಾರೋ ಒಬ್ಬರ ಹತ್ರ ಕೂಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ, ಜೀತ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬದುಕುವಂಥ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಈಗ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಹೇಗೆ ಕಾಡ್ತಿತ್ತೋ ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಈಗ ನಮಗೆ ಈ ಅರಣ್ಯ ಇಲಾಖೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸರ್ಕಾರಗಳು ಮತ್ತೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಶೋಷಣೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಗುಲಾಮಗಿರಿ ನಡೆಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿನ ಆಡಳಿತ ಸರ್ಕಾರ. ಇನ್ನೂ ಸಹಿತ ನಾವು ಅತಂತ್ರ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲೇ ಬದುಕಬೇಕನ್ನೋದು ಅವರ ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಆಗಿದೆ.
ನಮಗೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಂತು ನೋಡಿದರೆ ನಾವು ಎಷ್ಟಾಗ ಕೇಳೋ ಅದು ಯಾವ ಮರ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ ನಮಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅದು ಎಂಥ ಮರದೆ ಅಂತೇಳಿ. ಬಡ್ಡಿ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಅದು ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ನಾವು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಕಲಿಸಿದೆ ನಮ್ಮ ತಾತ ಅಂದಿರು, ನೋಡಪ್ಪ ಇದು ಒಂದೇ ಮರ, ಇದು ನೇರಳೆ ಮರ, ಇದು ಹಳತಿ ಮರ, ಅದು ಮತ್ತಿ ಮರ ಅಂತೇಳಿ. ಅದು ನಮ್ಮಂತ ಕಲ್ತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಈಗ ಯಾವನೊಬ್ಬ ಬಂದಾಗ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ತಗೊಂಡು ಈಗ ನಮಗೆ ಟ್ರೈನಿಂಗ್ ಕೊಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಬರ್ತಾಯಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಸರ್. ಅವರು ನನ್ನ ಕಲ್ತಿರೋದು ನಮ್ಮಿಂದನೇ. ಯಾವ ಮರ ಆಗಲಿ ಯಾವ ಪ್ರಾಣಿಗಳಾಗಲಿ ಅವ ಬುಕ್ಕು ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕಷ್ಟೇ. ನಮಗೆ ಅದು ನೋಡದೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಇದು ಇಂಥ ಪ್ರಾಣಿದೆ, ಇದು ಇಂಥ ಮರನೇ, ಇದು ಇಂಥ ಅಣಬೆಗಳೇ, ಇದು ಇಂಥ ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಳೇ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ. ಅವ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಹಿಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ನೋಡಬೇಕು.
So really lovely. If anyone can understand the subtitles or read them, let me know. Sure. I don't know if people heard from Zoom, if there's people can vaguely put thumbs up or something. I don't know.
Say a little summary for the Zoom.
Okay, so basically there was kind of two people speaking, and the first guy, Shiva, was talking about how now to get into their territories they have to trespass through under wire and into the estates, through the coffee estates and other people's plantations and so on, just to get to their houses, the houses that they used to have, which are now kind of stones on the ground. The other guy was talking about how the Jenkinson can identify plant and animal species just by looking at it, and yet now conservationists and others who had been first taught this information by the ancestors of the living Jenkinson are now coming and trying to explain to the Jenkinson about the ecology. They were the ones who knew it in the first place.
Where is this?
It's in Karnataka state in the south of India. Yeah. I think it's very interesting, firstly, what the first guy at the beginning, Shiva, was talking about in terms of, he said this is the same what the British were doing to in India now, the same kind of colonial pattern is happening to us, basically. And what the other guy was saying about, we know about nature just by being in it. This is a very central theme of what I want to be talking about tonight. Human beings know how to connect with our fellow species because we all rely on nature. Whether you forage your food from trees, whether you harvest it from fields, or whether you buy it from a supermarket, all of us depend on an intact ecosystem. It's just that we've been severed. We can't see that when you're buying your food from the co-op or whatever it is. But if you rely directly on nature, you know whatever tree or animal species might be, far more than any kind of corporate or mercenary ecologist, as I would call them, who's trying to come in and tell you what's happening. So how does this link to what's happening in the English countryside and the separation of people here from nature as well? Well, I'll briefly talk about, I'll go on to that in a second. I'll briefly talk about how bad this can get. This is in Karnataka, Kaziranga National Park in India, where the authorities basically imposed a kind of shoot-on-sight policy towards indigenous peoples, towards anyone they're accused of trespassing or being into the national park. It's been brilliant campaigning. Some of this violence has been reduced, but I think, if my figures are not wrong, between 2014 and 2017, 50 people were extrajudicially killed by anti-poaching squads in Kaziranga, where WWF has backed rangers with supplies and arranged combat and ambush training. MK Yadava, who was at one point the director of Kaziranga National Park, said, and I quote, "Never allow any unauthorized entry, kill the unwanted. If a question arises as to which rights shall get higher priority, it shall not be human rights." Again, tourists are allowed into Kaziranga National Park. The British royal family has been there. Filmmakers go there and so on. Adivasis, indigenous people, the ones who've been looking after nature and the park for so long, the ones who maintain the biodiversity, they are being shot, they are being tortured, arrested, and we see this pattern, as we know, repeated throughout indigenous territories around the world. The origins of national parks have come from game reserves, basically. Europeans, hunters have been coming there and killing animals in the name of trophy hunting, exploiting resources. National parks began through shooting animals through guns. They ended shooting them through photographs, but the effects are the same. It's a place for Europeans and for capitalists to have fun and to do what they want, while making the ecology get worse. The indigenous peoples and local communities are kicked out and are made to suffer as a result. Again, how does all this link to what's happening in the English countryside? Well, this is Kedleston Hall in, again, using the wrong blooming mouse. So I'm getting very confused. Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire. This is a massive estate which the ecology is pretty bloody awful. It allowed sheep to go and graze, and it's basically been done through the enclosure and kind of taking away people's land in Derbyshire. And all of this mansion was basically built up through colonial wealth. The bloke in charge of this, Lord Curzon, I don't need to say too much about him because he really speaks for himself. Anyone who wears that kind of thing, I mean, it's just actually beyond belief. Sometimes the aristocracy really shoot themselves in the foot, and it's so hilarious. Lord Curzon was at one point the Viceroy of India. He was also leader of the House of Lords. He directly connects the suffering of indigenous peoples in India to the suffering of the rural poor in England. Not only was he the Viceroy of colonial India, he also had the idea of setting up Kaziranga National Park. He actually said, and I quote, the reason, bearing in mind he was a big game hunter, he destroyed enormous amounts of wildlife in India. He said, including in Kaziranga, the decline of wildlife in India is to blame for this is the unchecked depredations of native hunters and poachers, basically. So again, it's just incredible irony, the doublethink that we've been told, the inversion of the truth that the guardians of nature are to blame for its destruction, and those so clearly destroyers of nature and destroying the indigenous peoples and local communities as well, they are now praised as heroes. This doesn't look heroic to me. It looks like a knobhead, basically, but another such professional language. From 1700 onwards, colonial merchants acquired around 780 country estates in the English countryside. So the wealth that was built directly from colonialism and from slavery was used to enclose more land, to take away more land from the peasantry and the rural working class in England. So there was a kind of solidarity in nature separation. The enclosure of the commons was basically a very, very systematic way of taking away land, common land, from people in England. I'll talk about that now and what that kind of means. So at the time of Shakespeare, 30% of England was common land. A common land is where the public have rights to access land. You can graze your cattle, you can forage, you can pick up firewood. There was also a kind of open field system where you can kind of, every peasant, every farmer had some land to which they could feed themselves. This is really good for biodiversity because you're growing food in order to be able to feed yourself rather than just for maximizing profit. This is an example of this. This is a place called the Vial in Glamorgan in South Wales, where they've kind of resurrected and preserved some of this open field system, common system, etc. It's incredibly good for local biodiversity. It's a kind of early example of what we would call, in the English context, wild service, having a reciprocal relationship with nature. And yet, through enclosure, now less than 3% of England is common land. Land was systematically forced, people were taken away from the land. And this process of which it happened, there was a feedback loop, right? So land was taken away from the poor in England and it was then exported overseas. The idea was, this is so great, we're making so much money. Rather than letting the rural poor just have their land, we can use this land, we can fill it with sheep, we can plough it into monocultures, we can use that for profit. This was taken overseas and used through enclosure in places like India and around the world. And the process was then taken back and blamed upon, the rural poor became increasingly blamed and kind of likened to indigenous peoples who were already being dehumanized. And again, you can see some quotes about that from the proponents of enclosure. John Beller's 1714. Our forests and great commons make the poor that are upon them too much like the Indians, for which he meant indigenous Americans, being a hindrance to industry and a nurseries of idleness and insolence. Hooray. Yes. Oh, or maybe not. John Middleton, 1807. Stone walls, best of all, for enclosure, as they exclude hunters who were another species of destroyers, those imitators of the life of savages, by again which he means indigenous peoples, are as destructive in a well-cultivated country, and foxes and wolves would be in a hen roost or a sheepfold. They speak for themselves again. These words are just, you couldn't make it up. They're pantomime villains, these people. Another quote here, Charles Vancouver. In the commons, labourers become in a manner independent of the country gentlemen and are therefore prone to creating difficulties. There are endless quotes like this by the proponents of enclosure. They were describing the rural poor as being like nettles in a dung heap. And there was a kind of almost like a racialization they were trying to impose upon poor people. So I learnt this quote from the 19th century. They were describing rural people in Norfolk being like darker specimens of peasant and stuff. And they were trying to basically show that the rural poor had to be like savages. They had to be like, less than human. Again, as a kind of excuse to kick them out of their lands and so on. And they also had an obsession with ploughing these things into monocultures, right? So along with preserving their own monoculture of the rich, with their harpsichord music and their fancy estates and their received pronunciation and so on, they also ploughed our fields into monocultures as well and got rid of the biodiversity of the commons. So Charles Vancouver would talk about how we need to get rid of all of these types of flowers. Everything is a weed, unless it's, looks particularly pretty for me, a nice type of rose, or unless it's useful for profit, get rid of it. And the commoners, again, get rid of them. It's a kind of systematic ploughing of the land and also of people's culture and livelihoods as well. The rural population of England and Wales, because of this, fell by 42% from 1801 to 1901. People were effectively forced out of their lands and into factories and so on, into workhouses. If you're wondering why we haven't got much of a good food culture in England today, and they seem to have done in the rest of Europe, we were the first country to industrialize. People had the basis of an independent livelihood taken away from them, and they were forced into cities where they were kind of fed kind of early versions of processed food and really bad food, basically. They were severed from that connection they'd had of growing food for themselves. Millions of people had customary and legal access to lands and the basis of an independent livelihood taken away from them. The Highland clearances in Scotland are remembered for being a truly traumatic and terrible experience. The English clearances, which are incredibly similar, basically the same process, are not remembered at all. And even though it happened, more earlier. It happened earlier ago, basically, and it seems to have been pretty much forgotten. But as we can call it enclosure, or you can call it the English clearances, but it was the same principle.
Well, so a lot of them were shipped abroad.
Yeah, that also happened as well. So you can see this kind of very quaint, lovely English countryside scene. This lovely dry stone walls, isn't it pretty? This is directly from enclosure, right? It's the idea that you are fencing off people, you are parceling off land, so that it can be controlled by large landowners, by early capitalists, that kind of thing, basically. It's a systematic withdrawal and cutting off of people from the land, basically. Right, so enclosure is colonialism, colonialism is enclosure. So again, this led to a kind of feedback loop. Land was, common land in England was enclosed, and the practice was exported overseas. So you can have a kind of similar process with, overseas common land or land which was owned by indigenous peoples and local communities was enclosed, and then the practice was re-imported to England. The wealth that was generated from these estates, the practices was re-imported to England, and it led to a kind of positive feedback loop. So I think there is a kind of sometimes unspoken solidarity between the suffering of peoples at this time. Capitalism, colonialism went hand in hand through the destruction of nature, the separation of people from nature, in order for big capital to continue to make profit and tear us as human beings away from our natural connections with our fellow species, basically. In terms of the effects of mobility on the rural poor, this is John Clare, wonderful peasant poet of the 19th century, who wrote beautiful poems about life before enclosure in the Northamptonshire countryside and life after enclosure. This is a couple of short extracts from a poem of his called The Moors. Unbounded freedom ruled the wandering scene, no offensive ownership crept in between. Now each little tyrant with his little sign shows where man claims earth glows no more divine. But path to freedom and to childhood dear, a board sticks up to notice no road here, and on the tree with ivy overhung, the hated sign by vulgar taste is hung, as though the very birds should learn to know, where they go there they must no further go. Beautiful words from John Clare. And again, John Clare was not scientifically trained whatsoever. He hated famously the Linnaeus system of naming animals. He named animals whatever the hell he wanted to, and scientists who could have now studied his words were like, blimey, John Clare could identify an enormous amount of species. It's just because he had time in nature. He spent his entire life running around looking at flowers and skipping and gambling around the fields and just really loving nature and really understanding it, and it's a kind of really lovely, wholesome way. He ended his life in a mental asylum, basically, and he was absolutely traumatized by what had happened to his countryside. Of course, this was at the time when the state was locking up anyone in a mental asylum that they didn't like, and to some extent some of that kind of stuff still happens, but at the same time, I think it's very likely indeed that John Clare and many other rural people were pushed to despair. I'm absolutely convinced. The independent livelihood taken away from them is a very traumatizing experience, and psychologists and others have done incredibly good work on this and talked about how intergenerational trauma has scarred people living in the UK today. Processes of enclosure. It's not natural for human beings to be without land. You don't necessarily you might not want to graze your cattle on the common or forage for food or whatever, but just having rights to access nature, being cooped up in a house all day to look at phone screens and that kind of stuff, not having the right to be outside is a human rights abuse, and it should never have happened. So it's understandable that this trauma has been passed down from people like John Clare and so on. How violent was this process? Well, I took this photograph. This is a man trap, as it's called. This is taken in my village museum. It's designed to break someone's leg. If you're trespassing, you're poaching, it's designed to break your leg or maim you in some kind of way. In the 90s, about the time that I was born, there was an old guy in the village, and he remembered when he and his mate were little children, they used to run across a meadow just to go and play with each other. And one of the landowners from the Fordham family said, "If I see you guys messing up in my land, I will set the man trap for you when you're not looking." that was the man trap that he was going to set for these little children. This is the kind of levels of fear, I think, among every person that didn't grow up with the right to roam, like young people have today in Scotland. We have this incredible fear. I mean, I worked for the Right to Roam campaign. I trespassed the entire time. If I still get scared when I'm in the countryside, seeing a sign saying, you know, no trespassing, seeing signs, you know, seeing 4x4s coming and chasing me, seeing barbed wire. It's a huge fear. There are fences in our minds as well as on the actual physical shape of the countryside. Yeah, really, really kind of awful things. Looking at the notes here. And yeah, so we never really think about enclosure in the UK really, except, and this was sent to me second-hand or third-hand by a mate, this is from a Year 9 textbook. And you are being told basically here how to convince farmers that they should enclose their land. Basically, that enclosure was a good thing. You're improving the land. So as you can see here, we argue about how to use land in common fields. You can't just have people sharing the land. They won't get on with it. You can't trust people. The common land is a waste of soil. You know, the farmers only grow enough for themselves. You know, why aren't they growing enough that they can sell? So again, if we're taught about enclosure, anything about enclosure at all, we're taught, well, it was probably a good thing. You're making the land more productive. It's a good thing. And again, similarly, when I was at secondary school in 2009, I was in Year 9, and I remember that we had 1 hour on colonialism and 1 hour on slavery. And the teacher, during the 1 hour on colonialism, literally said, I think the empire was basically a good thing. And it's this kind of total horrific separation of the truth, this inversion, again, of the truth, that colonialism was good, that enclosure was good, that these things were somehow good for nature, and this total double think, this total inversion of the truth. Again, from my own village, it was interesting. It's easy to see how we got into this mess. On Sunday, I went to our museum archives and I had a look through some of the quotes of what the aristocracy was saying around this kind of time. There's a wonderful quote from the relative of the bloke who set the man trap. He used to boast about how many animals he killed. He said, in my traps, I've caught this August, 878 young birds and 107 old birds. But I imagine that this relatively low number is because of the insects and seeds of knotweed must be scarce at this time of year. Again, it's just absolutely incredible the kind of levels of thinking. Why do you think the wildlife is going down? And, you know, house sparrows, most of which he was catching a lot of house sparrows, they've declined by 70% since 1977. Like, the levels of biodiversity now have just been totally ripped to shreds. And again, the rich and powerful, they're allowed to go hunting. They're allowed to do whatever on earth they want. The rural poor and you know, regular common people are not allowed this. It's a total inversion, a separation of us from nature. What effect does this have on us now in the countryside? Well, this is a wonderful study done by the University of Sheffield, showing just one family. So shows great-grandfather George, aged 8 in 1919. He was allowed to walk 6 miles to go fishing. If you look at now his son Jack, aged 8 in 1950, he could walk about 1 mile on his own to the woods. His daughter Vicky, aged 8 in 1979, could walk around to the swimming pool alone about half a mile away. And her son Ed is now 8, is only allowed to walk on his own to the end of his street, 300 yards. You know, and there's a brilliant author, Jay Griffiths, who's actually part of the Right to Roam campaign. He's written a great book on this called Kith, which talks about Indigenous people's relationship with the land and how they allow their children to have levels of freedom and so on. Of course, this isn't only to do with enclosure, land being taken away from us. A lot of this is the fact that I think part of this is to blame on the media. We're being told constantly if you let the children run outside, they're going to be killed and maimed and all the rest of it. I think part of it is also coming from a general political system and hundreds of years of general disconnect from nature, right? And taking away people's trust in the land and so on. And also the fact that there's nothing to do if you don't own the land anymore. And if all around you is fields, even if you had the right to roam, you can walk around the field edges. People don't have the right to grow crops, to kind of do whatever they want, to go fishing, you know, it's to go swimming. All of these kinds of things are banned. There are fences in our minds as well as out there. The level of disconnect and the level of kind of mental health effects of this has been really devastating. So what does it mean in terms of the right to roam, in terms of access to nature? So bear in mind that Scotland since 2003 has had a national right to roam. You can go basically wherever you want in Scotland. You can wild camp, you can swim in the rivers, you can walk, you can do what you want. You can't trample over crops, you can't, you know, walk in someone's school playing field, you can't walk in someone's back garden. But if your back garden is in 50,000 acre estate, it's not your back garden. The public should have right to access it, basically. So in Scotland, you can basically go where you want, over 95%. This is the situation in England. We are barred from 92% of the countryside. We have a right to roam over only 8% of the English countryside today. And large landowners, conservatives and so on will say, well, we have a great tradition of footpaths in this country. It makes up less than 0.2% of land in England. They will also point to Dartmoor, where you have the right to wild camp. Again, less than 4% of land in England is wild campable on, and the Dartmoor landowner, Alexander Darwell, really nasty guy, is trying to take that right away from us again. It's a totally different system, this total restriction from nature. If you were to parachute someone from the sky and drop them randomly on England, 92% chance they basically, you're landing on property which you're not allowed to be on. And again, this isn't people's back gardens. People will tell you, England is full of space, Scotland is very different. The Scottish Right to Roam Act brought access to people in the lowlands of Scotland. The Highlands were already basically de facto access. Very little of England is actually built upon at all. They say that this country is full. If England is full, it's full of green and blue space, but it's hidden behind barbed wire and fences and so on. So I think the crisis of nature is a crisis of biodiversity, basically a crisis of access to nature. We are one of the most nature-depleted countries in Europe, but study after study has shown we also rank bottom in terms of nature connectedness. Half of British children surveyed recently couldn't identify symbol species like bluebells or stinging nettles. 83% couldn't recognize a bumblebee. There was a study recently done by A-level biology students. A-level biology students on average couldn't recognize more than 3 native British flower species. Most concerningly, neither could the A-level biology teachers recognize over 3 species of British wildflowers. Yeah, but I don't think it's the fault of the children, nor is it the fault of their parents, nor is it the fault of their teachers. It's the fault of a systematic trauma and messing up and total severance of people from nature. This, removing words from dictionaries that of like daffodil and bumblebee and replacing them with words like selfie and things like that, and in TikTok and that kind of stuff. It's, Robert McFarlane's written a brilliant book on this called The Lost Spells. A total systematic disconnection of people from nature, basically. And in terms of biodiversity, as I say, since 2000, according to one study, there have been many others, flying insect numbers in Britain have decreased by 60%, bearing in mind they underpin our entire ecosystem. Since the 1930s, we've lost over 97% of wildflower meadows. These were not destroyed by people going for a walk. They were not, the grouse moors which are being burned, which are full of carbon, were not destroyed by people going for a walk in the countryside. The people who release over 50 million pheasants, a non-native game bird, and then line them with lead shot in the countryside, the people who chop down our forests, the people who fill our rivers with excrement, they are not us, they are not the public. We are not responsible for this. It's the rich and powerful who are responsible for it, and this goes hand in hand. It's the 2 sides of the same leaf. I like to use that analogy rather than coin because it's just a nicer, less capitalistic analogy. 2 sides of the same leaf. The stiles which our grandparents climbed over are literally now covered in barbed wire. In many places in England, you can literally see where there was a footpath, where there was access to land. And I will tell the landowners sometimes when I'm trespassing around my village, there was a footpath here. You don't know about it. We know what happened. I know for a fact that my forebears had rights to access this land, but you're now denying it. Basically, it's a total crisis. It's getting worse and worse as biodiversity is decreased. Our access to nature is being decreased, and this noose is tightening again and again, and more, basically. So nowadays, you'll see signs like this: danger, keep out, private property, no public access. 97% of our rivers we have no kind of uncontested right of navigation. It's nothing to do with our safety. It's nothing to do with protecting the rivers. It's to stop us, the public, from noticing that river companies are polluting our rivers, are treating them terribly. The landowners have access to these rivers. We, the public, do not, basically. Next time you see a sign like this in the English countryside, feel free to ignore it in most cases and hop the fence. Thoroughly encourage you to do so. If you go to the Right to Roam website, we can give more advice on how to do so and so on. But also question, why are these signs really there? Is it really to do with safety? What's going on behind here? Very considerable chance that it's not just a landowner having a nice picnic, but it's something's going wrong. They're releasing pheasants next to SSSI woodlands. They are burning grouse moors. They're pumping rivers full of crap, etc., etc. There's all kinds of horrible processes happening to nature, literally behind closed gates. The vast majority of destruction to nature does not happen in the public eye. When it does happen in the public eye, on places like the River Wye, which is a very rare river in that we do have some access to it, the public are now taking action. The public are acting as its guardians because we have connection to it, right? So nature is not something out there. This can be best explained by this wonderful guy. This is David Kopanawa Yanomami. This is a Brazilian indigenous leader from the Amazon, leader of the Yanomami people. Davy visited the UK for the first time in 1989. It was part of his people's campaign to stop illegal gold mining on Yanomami territories. And he went to the English countryside with his friends, and it was really fascinating. Davy, again, he's not been trained in science, he doesn't know the history of the right to roam. Just by being in the English countryside, he saw it as being like an apocalyptic wasteland. He says the white people's ancestors did not take care of the forest with which they came into being the way ours did. First, they started all over their own forest. They keep only a few patches of forests left now, which they have enclosed in fences. Now there are few trees left on their sick land, and they can no longer drink the water of their rivers. This is why they want to do the same thing again where we live. Again, so much of land is being destroyed here. You have to go all the way to Brazil to chop down more land and for capital to continue increasing. Davy also hated the idea of humans being separate from nature, and he says when they speak about the forest, these white people use another word. They call it the environment. It is what remains of everything they have destroyed so far. I don't like this word. The earth cannot be split apart as if the forest were just a leftover bit. He says, I told the white people, you often claim to love what you call nature. Do not settle for making speeches, truly defend it. All its inhabitants already speak to us with the fear of disappearing. You do not see their images dance, you do not hear their songs in your dreams. Yet we shamans know how to listen to the bees' distress. They are asking us to please speak to you as your people to make you stop eating the forest. And it's really interesting when Davy talks about such things, he's not just saying, Davy and other Indigenous leaders that I've spoken to as well, if not just saying, look, we want solidarity, they're also saying, you have to sort out this mess that you started, basically. And when I've spoken to Indigenous peoples from West Papua, they're saying, we want support for our freedom, but we also want you to sort out the mess that started here. The kind of, it's that nature has to be protected in solidarity with human beings. We have to have this as a unified, cohesive strategy to stop this crisis of biodiversity collapse and colonialism. This has to be approached holistically, right? This is a lovely image of Davy in front of Stonehenge. Davy basically he had a huge impact on him, going to Stonehenge and Avebury, other Neolithic stone sites. Davy recognized an inherent wisdom that was here from the hunter-gatherer people who used to live here, who he basically said that these stones are holding up the sky. He was the word that he used, which is a term very important in Yanomami philosophy. The idea that they were kind of maintaining the ecology of the place. The people who had erected them, Davy reasoned, were very knowledgeable. They had understood the environment as the Yanomami do, but their descendants had not taken care of them. They'd not taken care of the forest. So the English countryside had a really huge impact on Davy, and Davy actually has had a huge impact on the Right to Roam campaign, and we've been just so fascinated by this, and it's been a huge inspiration for the concept that we have named Wild Service, about a kind of reciprocal relationship with nature. I know we've managed to get Davy a copy of the book, and I think he was happy to see it. He doesn't speak English, but it was lovely to see a photo of Davy with the book, and with that illustration of him, which is in the book. This really got me thinking. As a guy from the English countryside, I thought to myself, am I ever going to get to the stage where I understand nature enough that I can almost like listen to the bees, and I can really know what nature needs? And I thought, well, see, I'm not Indigenous, and I've not come from a kind of conservationist background. I kind of thought, no, there's no way this could happen. And again, I think it's very important, the term indigeneity and the term, being Indigenous. The far right claim they are, we're Indigenous English people, or this kind of, nonsense. It's done in a really horrible way. Unfortunately, some people among hippies and among some in the environmental movement also say, well, great, if Indigenous peoples are close to nature, we can be Indigenous, we'll just claim that we're Indigenous as well, and it's all going to be okay. It's not the right solution. It's not appropriate or right at all. Indigeneity is not something you can claim. It's like, if you're white, you shouldn't try to claim blackness. If you're not Indigenous, you shouldn't try and claim indigeneity just because it's a social construct. These terms carry pain and pride and a history of suffering and exploitation behind them. It's not for others to claim. But I think what we're trying to argue in the Right to Roam campaign is you don't need to be Indigenous to care for nature. You don't have to have a degree in biology. You don't have to have anything. All you need is connection with nature. So our concept of wild service, we said from the get-go we were never going to define it as one specific term. This is not a to-do list. All it's saying is if you get out into nature, you will know, you will be able to take care of nature. And that's what we found. So this is a personal story from me. This is a wildflower meadow next to my house. It's a really beautiful meadow. It may have been there for over 1,000 years. It used to be a community orchard. So the villagers there had planted fruit trees and the flowers had grown, and it was a kind of wonderful act of wild service. There was reciprocity. The bees were helping to pollinate the flowers and the trees. The fruit was falling from the trees. The humans were harvesting the fruit. It was a wonderful reciprocal arrangement. In the 1950s, the area was bought by big landowners, and they basically have messed up the meadow a little bit. They chopped down some of the trees, they did a few other bad things, so it's not as rich as nowadays as it would have been, but it's still pretty rich in biodiversity. Again, 97% of all wildflower meadows have been lost. This is one of the only ones we have left. In 2023, a massive development agency came and said, we're going to destroy this meadow and build grotesquely unaffordable houses. Obviously, they didn't say grotesquely unaffordable, but they were. Obviously, we kicked up a massive uproar. We said, look, how dare you do that? This is an area of high biodiversity. And they said, oh, God, that's a problem. We've got a solution for that. We're going to bring in, again, what I would call mercenary ecologists. So they hired a corporate consulting ecological firm who went there. The landowner cut the flowers and the grass down. It was a cold January day or something. And these mercenary ecologists were there for a few hours and they said, well, I haven't seen many species. I haven't seen much. They said, they wrote in their official report, which one environmental scientist described to me as not worth the paper it was printed on. They said, it's of low ecological value. And the best bit of all, they said, we recommend a stringent offsetting program. And we think by your offsetting program that you've proposed to us, you will increase biodiversity by 8,000%. So you can destroy the entire meadow, you can bulldoze it, you can cover it in concrete. It's okay as long as you plant some rowan trees somewhere else, or you invest in some dodgy project overseas that will probably displace indigenous peoples. Biodiversity overall will have increased by 8,000%, and the meadow be damned, there's nothing of value in it anyway. So it's absolutely broke my heart. I remember literally getting on a Zoom call with a developer and crying my eyes out and shouting at him because I knew this was wrong, and I didn't have the ecology to explain it because I've just seen this official document, which is what the government's going to see, the local council's going to see. It really broke my heart. I've got 2 books of wildlife, of British insects, British wildlife, that kind of thing, which I've been reading, and I've been playing in this meadow my whole life. It's private property, it's fenced off. They never fenced off the minds of wayward children. I've been trespassing and climbing the gate in here since I was a child. And I began to realize that I knew the species here. I knew what the flowers were. I didn't know the names of them. A bit like John Clare, I don't particularly like the over-scientification. I don't know much about science or biology or whatever. But I looked at the names and I was able to kind of name all these flowers and species. And it soon became apparent to me that there were far more than the very few species the ecologist has named. This is the list that I've got so far. There's over 100 species. Again, I've clicked the wrong thing on the computer. There's over 100 species living in this meadow. Everything from grass snakes to lords and ladies, yellow rattle. There's pygmy shrews that live there. There's every kind of red kite and barn owls and everything. The most beautiful, wonderful things. Hazel and white bryony and bramble. Just the most incredible plants and animal species. Unlike a lot of my generation, I don't know much about mushrooms. But I haven't looked at the fungi, but I'm sure there's an enormous amount of it there as well. Just by being in the meadow, I've been able to learn these kind of things. I don't have any kind of biological training, but to me, it brought back the idea that this natural human severance from nature, this unnatural severance, this can be regrown. We can learn to reconnect with nature, and when we do so, we can use it to great effect. And because of this kind of citizen science, as they call it, we were able to mobilize much of the community, and eventually we managed to stop the development from happening and save the meadow. The meadow is safe for now. We haven't yet got it into, thank you. Cheers. So I wrote about that in the book, and then just before it went to publishing, and then we saved them, leaving it in a very kind of cliffhanger. What's going to happen? I don't know. And then just before the book was published, I found out that the meadow was saved, and I said to Nick, who edited the book, "Great, I'll add it into the book." He said, "Bloomsbury will have a fit. You can't add it to the book. Do it in the reprint." So for the hardback edition, it's ambiguous, but in the new edition, you'll learn that we did save the meadow, which is lovely. So the plan is to open it up. What we want to do is to open it up for the public. I've got 2 little nephews in the village who would never have been able to enjoy that meadow had we not saved it. I want them to be able to frolic in the meadow and have fun and build little dens and stuff, and and just really enjoy themselves like I did, but not have to have that fear of trespassing with them. I want them to have fun and to really enjoy it. That's the dream for us here in our village. So how do we fight back? What does this actually look like? How do we reverse this feedback loop, and how do we properly regrow things? Enter the Right to Roam campaign. Right to Roam was formed in 2020 during lockdown. Basically, we were kind of trying to push back against this idea. This was at the time when you were allowed like a short bit of exercise a day, right? And everyone was going out and really enjoying themselves, going around local footpaths, going around local areas and enjoying themselves. They were finding these footpaths being cut off. There was a huge backlash by landowners. People here remember it, right? and farmers and so on were saying, we don't like this. We don't like the public, the regular people, the poor being out in nature. This is terrible. And then we got this simultaneous idea because the overwhelming majority of the public, we were taking lockdown really seriously. We understood the science. We understood it was very important to be COVID safe. And yet the super rich and were having a lovely time with these massive estates that they had. Boris Johnson was having bloody parties in Downing Street. The public were being blamed for gathering together and so on. But the problem was land. The big problem with this was the fact that 92% of land was off limits to the public. We weren't doing mass trespasses during lockdown. This was a photograph taken last year. But we formed the idea and we set up the website knowing that after lockdown we were going to deliberately have these mass trespasses. So we've reignited the great tradition of mass trespasses in the spirit of the 1932 mass trespass of Kinderscout, where hundreds of working class communists from Manchester and Sheffield deliberately trespassed up in the moors and kind of helped to establish the Peak District, really. They were beaten up by gamekeepers, and it might be of interest to know that the National Ramblers Federation, such as it existed, said, you shouldn't have been trespassing anyway, it's kind of your fault. And the Ramblers Association to this day, unfortunately, are still saying, there shouldn't be a right to roam. We should just ask the landowners politely to have a little bit more access, please. It's not the way, stuff happens. You can't ask the rich and the powerful for things nicely. We have to demand it. We have to fight for our rights. We have to take direct action. And mass trespass to us is an act of what we call extremely non-violent direct action. We have a lot of fun when we go for mass trespassing. We have picnics. We do a lot of fun things. I'll just briefly go through some of that now. So these are some examples of some of the mass trespasses we've done. In Badminton Estate near Bristol, we got hundreds of people trespassing, led by wonderful botanists, led by professional foragers and people like that who could tell us all about the wonderful plant medicine and foods, natural foods that we could eat. We learned on here that dock leaves don't cure stinging nettle stings. It's actually a myth. It's the one thing we know about nature, and it's wrong. There's a plant called ribwort plantain, which actually does cure stinging nettle stings. Amazingly, my great-grandma, who was a Cockney woman from East London, she had folklore about plants that barely even grew there anymore, but she could remember that somehow. And some of these things that we call old wives' tales, they might be called that. The knowledge is true, the knowledge that we have lost. And on this trespass, we were kind of guided by experts on the plant life and to these wonderful areas of wildlife. We did a wonderful trespass on the River Derwent in Yorkshire, where we went litter picking along the riverbanks. The landowner came up to us and said, "What are we doing?" We said, "We're cleaning up your mess." He didn't have an answer, so he scarpered. We've kind of done some of this along with folk traditions. We did a wonderful Morris dancing trespass on the estate of Baron Richard Benyon. So by telling you his name, you can tell he was a Tory lord. He was the Tory minister in charge of access to nature, and he had a 5,000-acre estate, and we went Morris dancing on it, and it was incredibly good fun. One thing we want to do in this campaign is bring back a kind of sense of fun and of pantomime. So we've got this slogan, "Peasants, not pheasants," and we want to be kind of bringing back this and just talking about this in a kind of fun, kind of cheeky way, and just basically just making fun of the aristocracy who really don't like to be made fun of. But they call themselves things like the Marquis of Minas Tirith, and they give some of the names. It's like a kind of pantomime. So we've made it into a kind of pantomime, and connecting with nature is fun, and it should be fun, right? And there's also a very serious side to it. We want to talk about justice, about intersectional justice as well. The very first action we did, the second action we ever did in terms of the big outdoor actions, was an event called Kinder in Colour, and it was to commemorate the 90th anniversary of the Kinderscout mass trespass. And we walked the same route that the Kinderscout mass trespassers had done in 1932. Many of these trespassers, the leaders were Jewish and faced terrible anti-Semitism and discrimination and racism from the judges and when they were arrested. And Kinder in Colour was led entirely by people of colour. It was hundreds of people of colour walking this same route to highlight the levels of racism in the countryside. Less than 1% of visitors to national parks are black people and people in colour. People of colour are much more likely to live in areas with very little green space and face horrific levels of racism and discrimination in the countryside. So it was just a wonderful opportunity to take up space and to just organise with these incredible groups fighting for racial justice. For us, the right to roam, we don't just want a right for middle-class white people to have more access to nature than they already do. It's about racial justice, it's about class justice, it's about gender justice, it's about queer justice, and it's about linking these things together in a kind of holistic way. The right to roam is just a kind of we want it to be a cohesive movement for nature and for people, and to kind of bring these things together. And as Chris mentioned earlier, we also did one of the most wonderful events I've ever ever had the honour of taking part in. It's called the Dark Skies Trespass, or I think we called it the Night Skies Belongs to Everyone. It's now being called the Stars is for Everyone, is I think the kind of new naming of the World Camping Campaign. So we decided it's great doing this at daytime, why don't we do it at night? And Nick Hay said to me, what does that look like? I said, I don't know, but it sounds fun. So I said, there's stuff around, because this is just me, I'm interested in Indigenous peoples and I'm interested in anthropology. I said, it's something to do with Indigenous peoples and anthropology, and I didn't really know. So I reached out to the Radical Anthropology group, which is why I'm here tonight really, and I reached out to Chris and Camilla, and I said, I've learned a little bit through reading some of you guys' stuff and also through living with Indigenous peoples about the importance of the moon and of being able to see the night sky in human history. What does it really mean? And Chris and Camilla were just so fantastic and really broke down things from all the way from the myths of the Hadza in East Africa and some of the stuff we know about our hunter-gatherer ancestors of all of us, and also some of the English folklore about the moon and the dark skies. So we led a trespass in the Duke of Northumberland's estate. He owns over 120,000 acres of land, about over 4 times the size of Newcastle. And we got people from more marginalised communities, refugees, working class people from inner city Newcastle, out trespassing on a place called Lordenshaw, which is incredibly enough was a Neolithic rock art site where people who'd built the site had, and they've made these wonderful cup and ring marks, which some people think may possibly be representations of the stars. Certainly the people who made these carvings had access to the night sky. We went on the dark moon night of September. We were led by a wonderful guy called Neil from Go Stargazing, a kind of citizen astronomy organisation. And it was the most terrible, bloody, awful rainy day, and I was convinced it was going to be a failure, and I was literally seconds away from cancelling the event. And Nadia said, leave it, even if it's raining, we'll just get people outside anyway. We went there, and just as it was starting, the clouds cleared entirely, and Neil said it was quite possibly the brightest, into like the most starry night he'd seen in the entire year ever. It was so beautiful. We saw the Milky Way above our heads. We saw the Andromeda galaxy far away, and Neil put a telescope in my face, and I could see Saturn covered in rings. And I said, that looks like an image of Saturn, thinking it was like a slide. And he said, that's literally Saturn that you're looking at. And I couldn't believe it. It was the most spectacular thing I've ever seen, and some of the people there that we'd taken there was a couple of people who were refugees from Eritrea who said, I remembered sleeping under the stars in Eritrea, but I've never seen them in the UK. I've been living in a city in Newcastle. It was the most truly, truly wonderful night, and I talked about some of the anthropology and some of this kind of stuff that I learned through RAG, and we had folk singers and stargazers. It was the most really, really wonderful evening, and Right to Roam right now is organising something called Starry Starry Fortnight. I believe it's happening until the 11th of November. If you go on our Linktree and the Stars of Everyone Linktree, you can find more about